You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Billy Roper, who is the editor of the Roper Report and also a podcast and radio host under the same name, the Roper Report, is one of our subscribers to my weekly Dixie Heritage newsletter. So I wanted to give him a chance to appear here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. A lot of people accuse Billy of being a white nationalist, and for the life of me, I don't know why that is such a bad word. Oh, shouldn't have said that. Steve King asked the same question, and they almost kicked him out of Congress. Billy Roper is an interesting guy. He has degrees in anthropology. He's written several books, and in them he explains how what we're seeing in our country is something that has occurred in several different times throughout history. In other words, we are seeing the collapse of an empire, the breakdown of a society. That's what we're living through right now. And the exact same has taken place several times in various points in the history of civilization, and ours is just one in a series of them, and it's not even really unique. In fact, it's playing out the same way in our society as it has countless times in previous societies that have also collapsed. So it's a very interesting conversation that I know that you'll want to stay tuned for and that you'll want to listen to. For some reason, the split screen feature did not work when we were recording our interview using Skype. And so when Billy pops up, I'm going to disappear and vice versa. But still, it'll give you a chance to hear some very intelligent conversation. One thing that kind of struck me as interesting about yourself is that you have degrees in anthropology, and that's not a subject that a lot of people would have a degree in. And also, just because a lot of our listeners are like, well, what is anthropology? They probably think it has to do with dinosaur bones or something. I mean, it's actually the study of civilization and human nature, and correct me if I'm wrong, very almost parallel to psychology, only in the group, if you will, as opposed to the individual. So, when people want to be critical of some of the conclusions you've drawn, be they, with nationalism or with the balkanization of society and so forth, you're not just some crackpot out there, repeating stuff that he's heard other people say. I mean, you've actually gone to school for however many years and where you've studied this very thing. And not only did you study it, but I'm going to guess you probably studied it from the very liberals who you're confronting.
Exactly, sir. Yeah, I was originally a high school and junior high history teacher, and after a bit of that, I found myself just being a glorified babysitter. Didn't want to spend my whole life doing that. Trying to do classroom discipline and classroom management, spent all of my time, rather than actually having bright young minds that were thirsty for knowledge, absorbing anything that I had to teach. I've always loved history, and after it became obvious that I did not want to be teaching at the high school level, I went back to grad school. I was in a majority black school district, so that didn't help, but I went back to grad school and then finished up my master's and actually got my master's at MLA with a specialty in history and anthropology. You're right that, anthropology was formerly a hard science. It was a combination of, not just, like I said, not just archaeology, not just digging up bones, but the study of human relationships and how civilizations and societies are created and the way that human groups interact. Also, anthropology is the structure through which we, before we had DNA, learned about genetics by studying ancestry and heredity through patrilineal and matrilineal lines. And then, as we're all too familiar with, after the Frankfurt School came over, Franz Boas, who began to work to take over the academic field of anthropology to turn it into something really corrupt and degenerate, he began to deconstruct it along with their idea, that race is just a social construct which need to be deconstructed, and that there is no biological reality behind tribal or ethnic or racial loyalties. It's all really abstract and surreal and made up. And therefore, anthropology ceased being a hard science and became something much more abstract, really kind of now eclipsing and edging into sociology, with very little difference between the two. It's basically both used as propaganda. So you're right that it was 99 when I finished my master's thesis and defended it successfully against a very liberal academic board. But And I don't honestly know if they were just so happy to have me finish and out of there, they went ahead and passed it just to get rid of me, or if that actually was that convincing. But be that as it may, yeah, it was Paleo-American ethnic diversity, which was the purpose of my thesis. And that title, Paleo-American ethnic diversity, is probably what allowed them to have an open mind to reading it. And it was about Kennewick Man and the idea that Solutreans, that white Europeans were actually here in North America first before the Asian ancestors of the Native Americans crossed the Bering Strait and genocided them. It was pretty controversial, but they went ahead and passed it anyway. And so I had that master's. And it was shortly after that, though, when I was substitute teaching, and I was looking for a job teaching at a junior college level, thinking that I could be, a college history professor, and that would be really my life. That was my goal. In the middle of that, Dr. Pierce actually had need of a membership coordinator for the National Alliance, and he had the current chairman, Will Williams, contact me and ask me to come to the headquarters there in Hillsborough, West Virginia, and to attend a leadership conference, and then after that to stay on as his membership coordinator for the National Alliance. And I consciously crossed a Rubicon there. I really did think about it. I knew that once I made that decision, there would be no going back. I'd be burning bridges, and I would never have a normal life. I would never be, a college history professor after that. But I consciously made that decision with no regrets, and that's been my life since.
Something that you just said when you were talking about your master's thesis, it's something that's going to require, for a lot of our listeners, probably a big history lesson.
Okay.
And that is that you said that there were white Europeans that were on our continent before the Asian descended, who we think of as Native American Indians. That's going to require a history lesson. So is there any way that you could give it to us in kind of an encapsulated form?
Sure. And, obviously all of us in grade school and middle school and junior high and high school were taught that basically the Americas were empty before the Stone Age savages from Siberia filtered down and got lost following a mammoth herd and came across the Bering Strait, and that therefore they were the first Americans. And the extrapolation politically for that is that the original sin of white Americans, even before the sin of slavery, certainly before the Holocaust, with us not doing it, but not stopping it, but the original sin of slavery was predated by our original sin of genociding the Native Americans who were allegedly here first. There is a really good YouTube video series put out by National Geographic called Ice Age Columbus, and people can actually watch a fictional depiction of these Solutrean Europeans coming up the west coast of Europe during the last ice age and crossing to North America alongside the ice shelf that way, probably about 10,000 years ago, which would predate the Amerindians, the Native Americans as they're called. My theory was that whites, Solutreans, were here first in North America before the Asians, and that they were genocided and wiped out by those Asians. And that's why, if you look at the genetic and demographic differences between the Native American tribes from west coast to east coast, the thickest population of white Solutreans was, of course, on the east coast, where they first arrived and made contact, and they were less populous on the west coast. What kind of triggered my thesis was the discovery in Kennewick, Washington, of a set of human remains that were at first assumed to be a white pioneer or a murder victim because they were found to actually be Caucasian in ancestry based on the skeletal structure and the skull. The lie that race is just a matter of skin color or as a cultural construct is just that, is false. Any forensic anthropologist, any true scientist can identify the race of an individual based just on the bones, especially their skull and their dental construction, their mouth, their teeth. What happened was through the 1990 North American Grave Protection Repatriation Act, the local Indian tribes, the Umateas, claimed these human remains as being their own ancestor because their myth is that they were wholly formed from the earth in North America, not that they came here from anywhere else. They were created here by their gods. And so anything that might contradict that, any idea that whites were here contemporaneously with or even before Native Americans arrived would destroy not only everything that they benefit from, it's like get reparations and they get white guilt from, actually pointing out that white Europeans were most likely here first and they were genocided by the Native Americans' ancestors, destroys the original sin that whites are claimed to have had by coming to America and destroying, the kumbaya, peaceful, loving, diverse Indian tribes who all were in ecological balance with nature because they were little animals themselves. They were in the Stone Age, never invented a written alphabet or the wheel on their own. It's very controversial even today, but it's become more and more mainstream. People just don't talk about it. But like I said, the National Geographic Society actually created a documentary video series called Ice Age Columbus that people can see on YouTube that does probably a better job than I can of depicting and explaining the fact that white Europeans were here in North America first before the Indians.
And this wasn't something I planned to discuss, but I'm just interested in it, and that's why I'm asking you. Mm-hmm. I've spent a lot of time in Central America, and I don't know how many pyramids I've climbed down there. So genetically, are those a different set of Indians? Or because this is something that I've always wondered about, is given the timetable of when Indians were supposed to have migrated across the Bering Strait and so forth and come into North America, and then for them to have gotten that far south.
Right.
I've always thought they would have had to have done it sooner than the history books were telling me. So is that a different set of peoples, or did some people come over on boats long before they were supposed to be able to do that? I mean, how do you, and you also have to think of it this way too. The Indians in Central America actually had a civilization.
Yeah.
I mean, they built 17-story buildings.
Right.
They weren't living in teepees.
No, they weren't. You're right. That's a good point, Dr. Ed. I'm glad you brought that up. I actually focused on that in my thesis as well, and we've had more research since then that's borne out what the Native Americans in Central America themselves have always said. Everyone always assumed that the myths and legends of the Central American Indian tribes were really just made-up stories. But in reality, what we find now, based on our research, is that they actually were their tribal remembrances of how they got their civilizations. They actually were trying to tell it straight. In these myths, through the Aztecs, for example, and through the Mayans, the Aztecs have a myth of a historical hero, a legendary leader, a civilization founder called Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl, whose name means plumed serpent, is described as being a tall, blonde-haired man with a reddish-blonde beard, barrel-chested, who came across the ocean from the east, and he and people like him taught them how to grow maize and how to build their pyramids, and basically taught them the basics of their civilization. That's Quetzalcoatl according to the Aztecs. And parallel to that, the Mayans have a legend, a myth of their god they call Cualcan. And Cualcan is also described as being a white guy who taught them their civilization. So both the Aztecs and the Mayans actually credit the birth of their civilizations to white visitors who basically are responsible for all of it. And of course, I'm sure you're aware of the fact that, the Incan civilization in what is today the highlands of Peru, if you look at their mummies and if you look at their skeletal structures, there are a lot of people who believe that they also were Caucasian. The leaders and the founders of the civilization were Caucasian. They were not, Amerindians or Asiatics, Mongoloids. They were white. So the Incans and the Aztecs and Mayans, basically all three, have always said that their civilization were founded by whites, and that's why, when Cortez showed up to conquer them, he was welcomed as their great white god returning, because they had always thought that, hey, the guy who gave us our civilization is going to come back someday. And when these white people showed up, they naturally assumed that it was them coming home.
So these whites that would have come across on the ice shelf, obviously that would have even predated, say, a Leif Erikson.
Right. Leif Erikson came over, about the year 1000, the Viking era, and he explored, and his subsequent explorers, the Vikings, did have some colonies in Newfoundland and perhaps even inland. Not too far from me, there is a runestone in Oklahoma, which I visited recently, that the idea is that Viking explorers came up across the Atlantic, up the Gulf of Mexico, through the Mississippi River, up the Mississippi River to the Little Rock, to the Arkansas River, and from there to the Red River. And so they actually do have a huge runestone and some smaller runestones in Oklahoma, and I used that runestone as the basis of one of my books called Glome Saga to try to explain in a historically fictional manner how that might have occurred. But, in Minnesota as well, there have been runestones found, as well as New England. So I believe that the Vikings did explore North America. They didn't successfully establish any permanent colonies, but you're right that, that would be about the year 1000 or so, roughly, with some give and take on each side. And then the Solutrean era, the time when whites actually first came to North America from Europe, much, much earlier. If we think about, we are now 2,000 years from the time of Christ. And think about how many civilizations have risen and fallen since then, and how distorted and dim our collective memories are of just the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. And then imagine an epoch that is 5 times longer and how much has been lost. So we do see through glass darkly, but we are pretty clear on the fact that based on anthropological and archaeological evidence, that whites from Europe were here in North America, and that would have predated the arrival of the Mongolian, Asiatics, the Amerindians.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. Mentioned one of your books. Correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say on Amazon it shows that you've written 14 or 15 books.
15 currently published, fiction and nonfiction, and then one other that's a collection of a trilogy put together. The Haste and the Day trilogy is also sold as a complete set. But yeah, fiction and nonfiction, most of them have a political or racial message, either overtly or implicitly. And so I use everything from, historical fiction to alternate reality to science fiction to try to move forward the message, which I think is a benefit to our people. And then I also have nonfiction books which talk about America's future as I see it, most likely, to try to encourage people to prepare for that inevitable balkanization.
So explain, because I think most of our listeners will know what that word means, but some of them might not. So when you say balkanization, what do you mean?
Balkanization comes from the word Balkans, which refers to southeastern Europe, the Balkan area. Think of the former Yugoslavia, which during the 1990s experienced an ethnic civil war and broke up into smaller, more ethnically homogeneous states. And it's a good term to use because it's the most recent example we have in the modern era of that happening. America, as you and I both know, Dr. Ed, and probably most of the listeners are aware of as well, is more polarized and divided today than it ever has been before. There is a lot of movement on both fringes, on both extremes against the center. The center is eroding, and a lot of people are seeing the inevitability of the breakup of America, the balkanization of the United States, where we have a large multiracial empire breaking up into probably several more racially homogeneous, smaller countries. Something that's actually already happening organically, voluntarily. People are voting with their feet and separating out racially. I'll give you some examples. A lot of people notice that African Americans from the Northeast and from the Midwest are moving out of the cities there and back to the Deep South, around Atlanta, around Birmingham, around Montgomery. The reaction by the local whites there is to often move from the Deep South to the Upper South, here to Arkansas, or to Tennessee, for example, or to northern Alabama or northern Georgia. The reaction is Black areas are becoming blacker, and white areas are becoming whiter by percentage. And the same thing's happening out west in the Southwest, where Hispanics are doing what they call La Reconquista de Aztlan, and they are taking back what they feel was their original land, and through legal and illegal immigration, as well as just through a larger birth rate. Hispanics are taking over the Southwest. They've taken California. Now whites are minority in New Mexico. Arizona and Texas are on the way. As Hispanics brown the Southwest and Latinize it, whites respond by moving out of California and out of the southwestern states into the West and the Midwest to get away. And that's why Californians are trying to move to Montana and Wyoming and Oregon and Washington State out of California because California's lost. New Mexico is lost. If you see what the governor's recently done, thereby calling for all the National Guard units from every other state to leave and stop defending the border of Mexico with Mexico. Arizona is next, with the mayor of Nogales recently saying that he wanted the border wall in the middle of his town torn down because people might get hurt trying to cross it. And Texas is divided, but I believe that southern Texas is also going blue. These demographic changes, people voting with their feet and voluntarily migrating and separating out by race, is really accelerating the process of balkanization here in the United States as the different races kind of go to their different corners and get ready to come out swinging. The African Americans have long said they want New Africa in the Southeast, and Hispanics have long said that they want Aslan back in the Southwest. Whites may end up with everything in between the Rockies and the Appalachians, probably not the coast, which are too diverse and multiracial. I'm afraid that it's going to happen entirely peacefully. I believe that we'll have another civil war in this country that will lead to the final breakup of American balkanization. And my organization, the Showwall Network, is just a collection of white nationalist prefers in these white seedbed ethno-state areas. They're majority white and rural. We're encouraging white Americans to move out of multiracial and diverse cities, to move to majority homogeneous white areas, so that when this happens, they and their families won't get caught behind their own lines.
Because what you're describing, nationally speaking, is what I grew up in Chicago. In other words, all the blacks lived over here, all the Puerto Ricans lived over there, all the Mexicans lived over there, and even the whites were kind of divided. I mean, the Polacks lived over here, and the Italians lived over here, and the Croatians lived over there, and of course, then there was Chinatown, and, it was very divided that way. So basically what you're describing is the country as a whole, chopping itself up like Chicago did long before I was born.
Exactly. And, the whole idea, the definition we have of ethnic cleansing today, that word comes from the 1990s, from the Yugoslavian Civil War, and it was not pretty. It was not nice. They didn't sit together and sing Kumbaya and hold hands. They really pogromed. They purged each other. If you think about the ethnic and religious and linguistic and cultural differences between the Croats and the Serbs and even the Bosnians and the Herzegovins and the Kosovans, even the Muslims there, it's minor compared to the historical and cultural and racial and political differences that exist in America today between blacks and Hispanics and whites. And if nothing else, as much differences as there are between ethnicities of people, the races are even more divided, and especially in America, by our histories. Obviously, all it would take for this to happen is maybe next Cinco de Mayo, there would be a Mexican pride parade. They might just go through the formality of lowering the peppermint stripe flag and raising that eagle and snake over LA. That's just really a formality at this point because, California is already a sanctuary state. What happens is whenever any sanctuary city or county or state defies the federal government, and the federal government, because of political correctness and white guilt syndrome and weakness and liberalism, whenever the federal government abdicates the will to exercise its remaining power to hold the states or locals in line, then it doesn't matter how much power the federal government might have or how large the army might be, or it really just matters what they're willing to do with it, what they're willing to do to enforce their power. And when it comes to the border and immigration and enforcing national territory and sovereignty, the federal government has already indicated to California and to other environs out there that they're going to abdicate their will to exercise their power. So once Hispanics have La Raza de Aztlan and they have La Reconquista accomplished, they will then basically be a de facto part of Mexico, like Thomas Chittum wrote about in Civil War II. And what I wrote about in my book, The Balk, and my most recent book about the subject, ethnostate. So when Hispanics do that, if they believe that the Gadsden Purchase was inappropriate and that they were stolen, their land was stolen from them during the Mexican-American War, African Americans, maybe legitimately from their perspective, could say, hey, you know what, if Mexicans deserve their own autonomous, independent ethno-state within the borders of the former United States based on what happened to them, their mistreatment, then certainly we, with the history of 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow laws and being oppressed, second-class citizens, if they really believe institutional racism motivates the United States government, and the United States government and Americans, white Americans, are irredeemably racist, then the only solution from their perspective would be independence and autonomy. And if the Hispanics went first, I think the blacks would say, hey, what about our piece of pie? We're our 40 acres and a mule. I don't believe that white people have it in us to secede or to rebel against the government or to carve out an ethno-state of our own, but I do believe that we will de facto have several white ethno-states, if nothing else, in reaction to other people having theirs. When people have that, the scales come from their eyes and the veneer of civilization drops away, freed from the illusion of egalitarianism, reality is going to be red in tooth and claw once again. It's something that people should really be concerned about. There was a recent poll, 31% of Americans now believe that another civil war is likely within the next 5 years. 31%, about a third. The people who actually would answer that kind of question are probably thinking about it more than those who wouldn't know. But if you look at history, how many people, you and I lived through it. We're of the age, unlike these millennial people. We lived through the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the implosion, the balkanization of the Soviet Union. But if someone would have told us, in 1980, that the Soviet Union would collapse without a missile being fired or the Berlin Wall was going to come down without a shot, then we would have called them crazy. We would have laughed at them. No one would have believed it was possible. But, once these historical changes happen, there are all kinds of Monday morning quarterbacks that see that it was inevitable. There were plenty of signposts along the way. But however it happens, whether it's an economic collapse or a debt bubble popping, Third World War internationally, whatever the trigger is, if it's just the next series of race riots that through social media get carried on through a chain reaction from one city to another out of control. Our civilization is so fragile now. Society is so pulled apart, like I said, so polarized and divided politically and racially, that it's a tinderbox. And it would not take much for that balkanization to become reality. If people really don't think that it can happen in the modern era, once again, I just point them to the 1990s in Yugoslavia, where it happened in microcosm. Except that when it happens here, it's going to be, I think, even worse.
Of course, you talk about that balkanization and that process being a violent one. Do you think that it could have been peaceful if it weren't for the federal government? You talk about federal inaction. At least from my perspective, the federal government is far more active than it needs to be, and that's probably why that's going to be a violent transformation instead of a peaceful one.
Yeah, you're exactly. Multiracialism, as you know, Dr. Ed, does not occur naturally. People, if left to their own devices and left to their own freedom, would choose to, through freedom of association, be around their own kind. We all naturally have an instinctive draw and attraction for those who are like ourselves, and not just, racially, but ethnically as well. Like you said, those ethnic neighborhoods, and religiously and culturally. As a white Christian Southerner, I have an affinity for other white Christian Southern people. And that's just my natural culture and heritage and faith. That doesn't mean that I can't have common cause with someone from the North or the West or someone who doesn't share my faith. But that's my cultural and racial and religious identity. And those tribes are natural. Now, whenever you have an umbrella organization like the United States government, which, it was not founded to be a melting pot. It was not founded to be a diverse cesspool. Our founding fathers were white nationalists, and they intended this to be a white nation. We're fooling ourselves if we say it still is. It's no longer a white nation. It's actually a multiracial empire, which, like every multiracial empire, tries to force all of its populations to live together involuntarily and unnaturally. It's kind of like if, going back to my school experience, if you have a group of kids who don't like each other and they go into the cafeteria, they will naturally sit at separate tables. But if you force them to sit together, it's not going to be a very peaceful lunch. the federal government forces us together. They bring Section 8 housing into white neighborhoods to try to diversify them. Here in Arkansas, ever since 1957, we have spent billions of dollars in tax money trying to forcibly racially integrate our public school system, after the 101st Airborne came down and forced those 9 on us at Little Rock Central. And since then, every school in the state, but especially those in central Arkansas, have been subject to forced busing. And that's literally where they will bus white kids into black neighborhoods and black kids into white neighborhoods to mix up the schools racially as much as possible so that parents don't have any choice about where their kids go to school or with whom, and the kids don't have any choice either. The government, as you said, the federal government, is forcing us together. Now, if you have two guys who don't like each other, you lock them in a room together, probably only one's going to come out. If you allow them to go to separate rooms, then they might even make good neighbors someday, but that's not being allowed, and that won't be allowed, I don't think, because the federal government has too much to lose as being our masters. They actually do manipulate, and they abuse, and they oppress blacks and brown people. They have them on the Democratic plantation, for example, using them for the votes, and they don't allow them their independence and autonomy. If I had had what I would consider to be the misfortune to have been born as a black person, I would want my people to have their own nation where they could promote their own culture and their own heritage and have sovereignty and have control over their own destiny as a people, just like I want my people to have control over our own destiny as a people without being unfairly and involuntarily shackled together. And really, America today is like a multi-party marriage where, every single one of the spouses wants a divorce except the federal government marriage counselor who's getting paid to try to keep them talking and keep them together. I don't want to live in a country with African Americans or Hispanics or with Asians. I don't even want to live in a country with liberal whites, to be frank with you. And they, honestly, don't want to live in the same country with Billy Roper. I get that, and I'm cool with that. I wish that the federal government would just allow us to have a peaceful separation and go our separate ways, and they could do their thing and I could be me, but they're not going to allow that, I'm afraid. And because, like you said, they're not going to allow it peacefully.
Extra, read all about it. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, read all about it.
It's like John F. Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution necessary. Well, John F. Kennedy had a line about that as well, and I think they punished him for it. I believe that the federal government is trying to force us together for as long as possible. It's not going to work out for them, and when the multiracial empire breaks apart, those elites, their gated communities are not going to protect them, and their guards are going to abandon them. Their money is going to be worthless, and they will suffer the same fates as any white people who refuse to heed the call to abandon multicultural, diverse cities now and to leave.
Here recently I was asked a question, defining nationalism in biblical terms. And if you look up that word nation in the Bible, it simply could be translated as people. So, we think of a nation as a political construct that's operating within a certain group of boundaries. But that's not a nation, that's a state.
That's correct.
And a nation and a state are two totally distinct entities. We had a nation in this country at one point because we had a nation that consisted basically of Englishmen. And when that group of Englishmen, that nation of Englishmen decided that they didn't like the government or the state that was governing them from 3,000 miles away, they set up their own state. But now I look some 200 and however many years later, and I see the state still exists, but I no longer see the nation.
Yeah. And that, of course, erodes any sense of national unity when you tell people that they cannot identify with one another by language or by race or by ethnicity or by common shared historical experience, because really being an American means your mom was able to stagger across the border before you fell out of her. If citizenship is so cheap, so easily granted, then it has very little value, supply and demand. And so being an American really no longer means much of anything because it can belong to anyone. It was not designed to, but now that's what it comes to mean. So, I love my people, but I fear and loathe my government. I don't identify with the United States government. I identify as being a white American. And you're right that a nation is not a political construct. That's a state. And a nation is a group of biologically related people who live together in the same area. So, even if they have no government of their own, we can refer to people being a nation, having a nationality. It's almost, a euphemism for race sometimes, kind of like culture is. When people say multiculturalism, then they really mean multiracialism. When people ask what your nationality is, they're not asking, if your ancestors were German or Swiss. Generally, they're asking about your genetic makeup, your hereditary ancestry. And so, I agree that a nation, as it actually is supposed to be defined, no longer exists in the United States of America today. There are multiple nations vying for control and undermined the white majority that created the United States of America. And in order to undermine that homogeneity, they have opened the borders and they have always supported the underdog and the counterculture to destroy traditional values. And so by opening the borders and bringing in other races, creating a multiracial cacophony where there's just, instead of one majority, there are all these minorities with no single plurality fighting for their slice of the pie, and the largest group doesn't really matter. The loudest and most shrill group gets the biggest slice of the pie. We know who the loudest and most shrill minority always is. That's what Dr. McDonald actually wrote about in the Cultural Critique of founding the NAACP and pushing feminism and pushing homosexuality and pushing everything else that's been degenerative and destructive of traditional values in the United States of America and for our people.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. And so is the nation recoverable in the United States? Or is it?
No, I don't think so. Now, here's the deal. I believe, think of a nuclear reaction. The way that a nuclear reaction happens is that, the atomic particles are pushed together. They're consolidated to a very dense form, so much so that they are forced to explode back outwards once again. That's how a nuclear explosion occurs. Once the people who founded this country are forced into white ethno-state areas, probably several of them, after the balkanization of America, and we have control of our own destiny once again, and we have united resource, we have united will. We're no longer having to feed minority races. We're no longer shackled by white guilt syndrome on 3 or 4 different levels. We're no longer allowing foreign alien voices to propagandize and brainwash and indoctrinate our children ourselves. We no longer have other people, outsiders, controlling our media and our entertainment and our government. Then after maybe a generation of that, we might very well recover the strength of will to retake the whole continent once again And that would ultimately be preferable. And like George Lincoln Rockwell said, this time the world. But first, we have to regain our foundation. We have to get our feet under us once again, and that will require the establishment of white ethno-states, where we'll have control of our own government, our own culture, and our own society once again. We will never vote our way to freedom. We'll never vote our way back to power. The demographic shift has gone too far, and will not do so through the ballot box, even on a local level. We're going to have to allow things to run their course. And, this is an organic process. This is a fin de siècle, the end of a civilizational cycle. We have this myth of American exceptionalism where we think that we're going to last forever, but in reality, all empires fall. And when ours falls, I think it's going to fall inward.
Well, I remember the day, or the night rather, that Barack Obama was, quote unquote, elected in 2008. I was actually preaching. It was in the Little Rock, Arkansas area.
Wow.
On Wednesday night. And so I had got into town on the Tuesday night before, and I played a round of golf, and I checked into a motel. It was a Holiday Inn. And then I, bunkered down in front of the television set there in the hotel room to watch the election results.
Right.
And I remember they're coming in. And I remember when the polls closed on the West Coast. Of course, Arkansas being in the Central Time Zone, so it was 9 o'clock local time when the polls were closing at 7 o'clock. I mean, I don't even think a full minute had passed from when the polls had closed. CBS was already reporting Barack Obama to have won California, to have won Oregon, to have won Washington State. Of course, there was the Electoral College for him. And so I flip over to CNN. They're doing the same thing. Flip over to Fox. They're doing the same thing. We're now maybe 90 seconds into this. Right. How in the world can they call an election in 90 seconds? And so that the fix is in. It's not legit. But anyways, I call my dad. My dad's in Florida. I call my dad and I ask him this question. I said, Dad, do you think that however many hundreds of years ago that somebody was sitting in his room as a citizen of the Roman Empire and watching the news and was consciously aware that they had just witnessed the moment where their empire had collapsed? Or do you think that they were totally consciously unaware of it and their kids were in some high school history class 400 years later being told that it happened?
That self-awareness is hard to grasp, because we live our lives a lot of times on autopilot, and every day kind of seems like the next. And, it is a slippery slope. It's a very gradual process. Degradation and degeneracy happens not overnight. Generally, it happens through a slow process, through tolerance and through permissiveness. Because, for example, let's look at the homosexual agenda. Originally, it was just that they want to be left alone and they don't want to be prosecuted. They don't want to go to prison. And so, we said, we're going to leave you alone, stay in the closet, and you won't go to prison. Thomas Jefferson, when he was the governor of Virginia, said that homosexuality should be punished by castration. And so we've gone from that to saying, we're not going to send you to prison, just stay in the closet and don't have it out flagrantly flaunting it about. And then they said, we would actually like to be allowed to have marriage. And of course, that was a recent battle that we lost. And their argument was, no one's forcing you to tolerate us or to hang around with us or to marry a gay person. You're not being forced to accept it. You're just told to leave it alone. Next thing you know is bake our cake or go to jail. This is a slippery slope, just one example. And the same thing is true of, race relations. It was first free the slaves. And once again, Thomas Jefferson, all the founding fathers, even Abraham Lincoln, wanted to free the slaves and then repatriate them back to Africa because they said the blacks and whites could not and should not live in the same country together. And it went from that to freeing them. And then it went from that to them having right to vote and making sure that they are equally represented in every occupation requiring affirmative action. And now, obviously, they have a more privileged position in the society we created than we do. But these things don't ever happen overnight. It's always a slippery slope. And the problem is like that frog in the pot of heating water. You don't know when it's time to jump. And just when you think it's getting too hot for you to stand, you're already croaked. Well, that's what's happening here in America today. We've had so much happening gradually that our forefathers never would have tolerated, and that we ourselves, if we think back 20 years ago, would never have tolerated. And it's happened so gradually that here we are in the middle of it, and it is our current day reality, present day, 2019, that this is the world we live in. And obviously, if you'd gone back to World War II and told the brave British and American soldiers charging up Omaha Beach into the face of machine gun fire that they had a choice, they could either speak German or their grandkids would be mulatto transsexuals, I believe they would have turned around and started shooting in the other direction. I really believe they would have recognized they were on the wrong side of that war. It was happening so gradually that they recognized it, and now in the space of a couple of generations, here it is. Well, we have to be responsible enough to say that just being conservative and dragging our heels against the entropic effects of the left as they use their forces and their radicalism, their extremism, to shove the Overton window of acceptable discourse leftwards is not enough. Conservatism is not enough. Reactionaryism is not enough. We have to be revolutionary ourselves. We have to be as extreme and radical in the other direction as the communists and the left is in their direction. And that's why I personally use the radical flank effect. I'm as radical and extreme as I can possibly be in my rhetoric and my actions without being illegal, so that I create wiggle room to my left for those who are a little bit more moderate than myself to seem more palatable and acceptable to the mainstream. And that's fine. You know, I accept that. That's my job. That's my niche, my raison d'etre. I'm fine with that. It's not for everyone, but, being on the tip of the spear is where I like to be. But you mentioned being in Little Rock, and so you're familiar with the state capitol and that area. So on March the 9th, the Shieldwall Network is going to be standing at the Arkansas State Capitol with other organizations, the Knights Party and League of the South, and Confederate 901 and the Highland. Arkansas Right to Life Association and NRA are going to be there as well. It's a twofold protest. It's one against anti-abortion, and one in favor of the Second Amendment, because there are two bills in the Arkansas State Legislature being considered. If they would finally admit that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has assumed room temperature finally, then we might have a more conservative appointee to the Supreme Court, and then Roe versus Wade could very well be, if not negated, then at least left up to the venues of the states. And Arkansas is joining Oklahoma and North and South Dakota and Mississippi, I believe, in passing laws that would be proactive in preparing the states to basically make abortion illegal as soon as they have the power to devolve down from the federal level after Roe v. Wade. And then the second thing is actually a red flag law being considered by the state legislature. We're confident that it will be defeated, but we're standing up for the Second Amendment as well as against abortion on the 9th. And that's one thing that the Shieldwall Network does, through Operation Newton's Cradle. Antifa will be there, primarily LGBTQPWXYZ degenerates, whatever they are this week. And they'll be there with their feminist and Antifa and communist and anarchist allies. They're always coming out against us. And we dox them, and we come out in the street against them face to face and put boots on the ground. And sometimes things get a little rough, but we don't mind. And that's really the way the history is made. We force them to show their true colors, and we allow our people, the people we're trying to reach with our message, to have a very stark contrast to consider us and them, and then to make that choice. Being a man of faith as you are, as I am, we live in trying times, challenging times, troubling times. But we know that our enemies hate us. The majority of people have contempt or disdain for us, to be frank. But that's because we are doing what is right. Jesus told us that the servant is not greater than the master. And if we are being Christ-like and trying to do his will, I believe that the world, secular forces, evil forces, the adversary will oppose us strongly. But we will prevail, because as long as we stay on God's side, we know that in the end, it's been foretold that he will win.
One of the things that we had talked about a little earlier, in the balkanization of America, I honestly believe that our constitutional government could survive and even thrive in such a situation. But we both know that the Constitution hasn't really been followed. And so given the fact that our government is no longer operating within the constraints of its Constitution, do you think that and we're not talking about the nation now, again, we're talking about the state, we're talking about the federal government. Do you think that the government will survive the balkanization, or do you think you're going to see the North American continent, or do you see the United States of America dividing up into multiple governments or multiple countries?
I do. I think that the United States of America, as we know it, will not exist a decade from now. I sincerely believe it's that close. I'm not even sure if we'll have another national election after 2020. We'll see. I do believe that the United States of America is going to divide up into several racially based ethno-states. I think that there will be a black ethno-state and a Hispanic ethno-state, and there'll be probably 3 or 4 white ethno-states, regionally separated and maybe with different forms of government that will fit the different regional cultures of the people. If you look at what happened in the beginning of World War II, the reason why Japan started invading other countries and the reason why they attacked Pearl Harbor was because Great Britain and the United States put trade sanctions and embargoes on them to deny them natural resources that an island nation needed to keep modern civilization and industry going on purpose, because Roosevelt wanted an excuse to get the United States into World War II. Japan had to conquer territory and create the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere to get the natural resources that had been denied through trade. Once the United States begins to balkanize and China loses the consumer market, which is the engine of its great economy, it will have also no other choice except to do as Japan did and to quickly conquer as much territory as possible in order to make up for those natural resources lost through their economic collapse, basically because of the loss of the consumer market of the United States. The Pacific will become a Chinese lake through their territorial expansion and militarism and imperialism. They may come wearing blue helmets as peacekeepers or as humanitarian forces to feed people who are suffering, but the reality is they'll stay and they'll take real estate. They may come saying that, hey, because of the chaos and anarchy of the United States right now on the West Coast, it's clear that the United States government can no longer guarantee the safety of Chinese citizens in the Bay Area. And so we're going to send in 500,000 Chinese peacekeeping forces to feed starving Americans and to protect our citizens, and they'll stay. And they'll take real estate. And I believe that the West Coast will be fought over between the Chinese and the Mexicans. I believe the East Coast is going to be pretty mixed up. That Bosnia-Wash corridor, the Mid-Atlantic from Boston to Richmond, is so built up and has such infrastructure that even being racially mixed, it could be possible for the United Nations to hold it together as a rump state. It may still call itself the United States of America, being ruled by the UN or not, but the rest of the country I don't think is sustainable. I do believe that the Southeast is going to be New Africa, the Southwest is going to be Aswan, the area in the middle, different regions. Here where I am, there's a cultural area I refer to as Ozarkia, and we have about 100 contiguous counties that are over 95% white. The Appalachian area of eastern Tennessee and West Virginia and Kentucky and the edge of North Carolina, the Appalachian area is also homogeneously white and a very similar culture. Up in New England, what Tom Kaczynski calls New Albion. He wrote a book called The Coming Civil War, and New Albion is an almost entirely homogeneous white corner of North America up there, the Midwest, the breadbasket, what the liberals call the flyover states. The red states are predominantly white as well. So I think that, white America could be from the Rockies to the Appalachians, but I don't believe we're going to hold all of it. Now, we may end up a generation afterwards reconquering all of it. In the meantime, I don't think it's sustainable to keep it united. And if there is anything, any entity, any state that still calls itself the United States of America after the balkanization, I don't think it will be coast to coast.
And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, because a large portion of our audience are very into their Southern heritage and history, particularly the history of the war between the states. And there are a lot of Southern historians who would make the argument race was not an issue in the South until the Yankee invader came and screwed everything up. Why is it that black people and white people could peacefully coexist and even work together then, but can't now?
I think probably, Dr. Ed, it was because then they still had a natural consciousness of the natural order of things. They were in tune with one another's differences. They weren't trying to conflate the role of one or the other. African Americans understood their role and white Southerners understood theirs. Of course, it was just a very small minority of white Southerners who ever owned slaves, as you know. Most white Southerners worked the land themselves and had subsistence farms or were tradesmen. They did not own slaves. But those who did maintained a natural order. And so they weren't trying to enforce any kind of mythical or artificial equality on themselves. And so because they weren't confused about the natural roles, they were able to maintain that hierarchy, that strata in their society. But once, through external force, as you point out, the natural borders of that society became not just eroded, but crushed. They were no longer maintainable. That, I had all my ancestors fought for the Confederacy, and I'm proud of that fact. I can tell you, what units they were in and what divisions and what battles they fought in. I can tell you their names, and I'm very proud of my Confederate ancestors. I'm proud to be a white Southerner. I had to take a great honor in that. But I honestly do wish that my ancestors predating them had the foresight to pick their own cotton. I really wish they had, just kind of like I wish today that white Southerners would pluck their own chickens instead of importing Mexicans to do it for them. I believe that it's been a mistake of ours to bring in outside cheap labor over and over again, all the way back to ancient Egypt. That being said, we can't undo that error. I don't think that we can unwind the clock and go back to the point where both races understood their natural place in the hierarchy and order. I don't believe that whites and blacks can live peacefully together in the South or anywhere else in North America. I believe that if they were separate from one another, they might learn eventually to leave each other alone, but that would be about the best we could hope for. And one thing I know as a Christian, I'm not trying to be a Bible prophet or anything like that, but I think that we can look at the world today and see that we are probably getting close to what's referred to as the end times. And I'm not a pastor. I don't call myself a preacher. I respect those of you who are, Dr. Ed, but me myself, I don't have that calling. I'll just say as a layman, I know for a fact, based on my reading of Scripture, when the Antichrist comes, the Antichrist will be preaching globalism and one world government. And the Antichrist will be preaching universal racial equality and egalitarianism. Therefore, anyone, whether they call themselves a Christian or not, who is pushing for multiracialism, they're already on Team Antichrist. But I do know that I, for one, would not want any people that I love and care about to be caught in a majority black urban area when stuff hits the fan in America, when the Civil War that is coming gets here. So here's the deal about the Showball Network. What I basically ask people to do is, number one, move out of racially diverse areas into majority white areas. Number two, become a person of influence in your community by getting involved locally through civic activism and social life, just have a life in the community. Number three, network with other like-minded people in your community to form a natural and organic circle of friends. Those are the three keys. And then you can recruit others of like mind and radicalize them rightward so that they see what you see. These things the Showball Network, my program, asks people to do. It's not watching a doomsday clock. It doesn't require anything apocalyptic or catastrophic happen. It basically improves people's lives already, whether anything happens or not. Whether there is a civil war or not. We're not terrorists. We're not outlaws. We don't get anyone in trouble. We actually help people improve their lives by becoming persons of influence in their community, which is good for their families and their kids, and also helping them move to wider, safer areas. And so everything that we do in the Showball Network helps improve people's lives now, with or without, stuff hits the fan type of scenario. But we do feel like it's very probable, if not inevitable, that another civil war and balkanization are coming. And we want our people to be prepared because I love my people, and I don't want someday to think, hey, my friend somewhere is dying in a majority non-white city, unable to get out in the middle of a race riot because I didn't have the guts to tell him that it might be coming and to warn him. I was afraid of being called a racist, so I didn't try to warn him. And his kids are dying now. You can imagine all the horrible things that could happen to a white family in that kind of situation. I don't want that guilt. And I believe as a Christian that we're told to be watchmen on the wall, and as long as we warn our people of what is coming, then we're free of that blood debt. But if we don't warn them, then their blood is on our hands if something happens. So that's my responsibility, my duty. That's why I do what I do.
Well, I am going to go ahead and I am going to pull the plug there because we are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I do want to thank you for being our guest. I want to encourage you to come back same time and place next week. We're going to have another great show for you. Until then, thank you to Billy Roper for being our guest this week. And to all of you, God bless. See you next week.